good to be back. I have been very busy, but I came up with a really exciting concept I haven't seen anywhere else before, and I think you might enjoy it. Renaissance reset. Yes, I said reset and not rebirth, because it seems that man tried his hand at giving birth to himself, as hardly a woman of significance was to be found after this so-called great rebirth. And the Medici Dynasty snapped up art, money, and religion for almost 300 consecutive years, which, of course, caused untold irreversible damage to our humanity's creative evolution. But I'm sure in some way that going into the darkness does help to bring out our light. Let's start with The Last Judgement, which is a painting by Hieronymus Bosch. And Bosch was a Dutch Netherlandish painter, and he was born in Brabant in 1450, if you want to get an idea of the date. Now, whenever I write the date, I write I-450, because that we know history was manipulated and changed by Scaliger. And it was Fomenko, a Russian professor and a highly acclaimed mathematician, who went through history and figured out that they added 1,000 years to history. But that's another video. So when I say I-450, it's 1450 in the History Liars books, okay? So as one of the most prolific and outstanding representatives of the early Netherlandish painting school, Bosch produced fantastic surreal paintings with a religious motif, mostly in the form of depictions of hell. And this is very interesting for a very good reason, so pay attention. Although he is said to represent the early Netherlandish painting school, emphasis on school, he was truly a representative of the church and its huge, what I call, advertising campaign to promote the notion of hell and sin. So I'm sure you just much rather look over there at the Mona Lisa, you know, the most famous painting in the world from the Renaissance. But let's get out of the matrix and take this look. So as this veil lifts, the truth just can't help but come out. And the truth about humanity's most celebrated rebirth in history, the Renaissance, is kind of a lie, because we need to be rightfully reclaiming our creativity for the purpose that God intended. So anyway, back to Bosch. In his lifetime, his work was distributed in the Netherlands, Spain, and Austria, and very, very widely produced. And his work was sort of gruesome and unearthly, and he had these depictions of hell. But he made them very popular, and they were very popular, and they were flung so far and wide because this was the message the church wanted out there. They wanted this hell on earth out there so that people would come running to them with their sins. It's worth a lot of money. So we have to remember that the church leaders of the time, which the Medicis were both popes and leaders and bankers, big alert sign there. Church leaders had made themselves the gatekeepers of heaven, and they were paid handsomely for bestowing upon themselves the power to forgive sin. So now there's an intermediary between God and humans. And it was Pope Leo X in particular, who was formerly Giovanni Medici, and he gave permission for the sale of so-called indulgences or financial instruments that purported to give those who purchased them a waiver from doing time in purgatory and to atone for their sins. So basically, artists were employed at that time to mass produce religious imagery, rather like an advertising agency would. You know, they produce branding for a large corporation. So anyway, Bosch had many family members who were painters. So after he drew the sketch upon the canvas, they would just come behind him and just fill in the color. So it was a very efficient but primitive Photoshop method of mass production of imagery for those times. So it was practically an art factory. And in those days, obviously, there was no cinematography, television, computers to advertise their religious campaigns. However, the printing revolution had already started in Germany around I-440. So when Gutenberg invented his printing press, now just one printing press could produce up to 3,600 pages per workday, which left the time-consuming hand copying methods in the dust. So as early as I-423, the first European woodcut printing was used for printing religious images in particular. And in I-454, Gutenberg printed the first Gutenberg Bible. So there you have the complete recipe for the distribution of a very early MK Ultra propaganda prototype. So these historic markers prove that human creativity has been used for centuries to promote the agenda of the overlords, to keep them in power and the people enslaved through programming. But Bosch wasn't the only artist whose work they used to promote their ideology on a grand scale. Jan van Eyck, I-395, 1395, that was when he was born. He died in 1441. He was also an early Flemish Renaissance painter active in Bruges in the Netherlands, who died just before Bosch was born. So we're kind of going backwards in time here. And he painted a piece called the Ghent Altarpiece. And in this painting, he clearly depicts the church hierarchy just dripping in their gold and riches and symbolism and everything. And behind them follow the poor, sinful masses. Just a great illustration of the church as leaders. So then there was Giotto. He was yet another Italian painter who worked during the Gothic proto-Renaissance period, which would be like the late Middle Ages. And he was another painter of religious iconography. And his masterwork is the decoration of the Scrovegini Chapel in Padua, depicting the life of the Virgin and the life of Christ. And he finished that in I-305, and he died 2 years later in 337. So he was a prolific painter and architect from Florence. But although his art was religious, he did not portray images of hell in his work, as did his successors Bosch and Van Eyck. So this tells us that the beginning of the Renaissance was the forerunner of the depiction of hell to be used as fear porn in order to fill the Vatican coffers. And there were many second sons of the elite who were directed toward careers in the church. So therefore, it was no coincidence that Pope Leo X took his papal seat in I-513 without ever even having been a bishop or a cardinal or anything. And so then the Medicis now had a trifecta of control in Italy. So they had banking, religion, and art. So then by the 1300s or I-300s, history tells us that much of Europe had been Christian for 1,000 years. And for part of that time, the political and social structures had been dominated by the feudal system. And they say that the ancient classical civilizations of Greece and Rome had been almost entirely forgotten by then. But in my timeline of events, Tartaria, not ancient, was the actual great lost civilization and not Rome, which tells me the Renaissance itself may have been the beginnings of a reset which would deliver the final nail in the coffin of Tartaria. Now, that's why I think this is so exciting. So it is quite possible that the perpetuation of these hell optics, you could call them, heralded in the rise of the Jesuits and their endless quest to take over the earth, which today is commonly known as the globalist agenda. So here we see how important a role art is playing in the psyche of the masses and how the creativity of humans is used in our own demise. So this model extends itself deep into the glory days of the Renaissance, where we see Leonardo da Vinci beginning to create his weapons of mass destruction, prototypes, like his human body slicer, which we hardly ever hear anything about. It almost appears that this is the real dark ages disguised as this great bright rebirth, possibly using the usurped sculptures from Tartaria. Think about that for a second. And I think they also claim them as great works of their own age, along with the architecture that they inherited after they got rid of the Tartarians. So with dynastic de Medici bloodline entering the picture to fund the arts, on the one hand, they are financing and commissioning great works of art, such as the Sistine Chapel, so we are told. And then on the other hand, they're financing the development of a new industrial war machine. And those were the first attempts at robotics as well, because Leonardo did models of robots with wires and everything, movable parts. And this, you can see, is like very early transhumanism. So Da Vinci created the first robotic prototype whilst also working on cadavers to get inside the human body. They started going in there and looking around at every single vein and blood vessel because they wanted to see exactly how it operated. So they just ripped up bodies and looked at them. So it is this very macabre side of the Renaissance that is often just skimmed over to shed light on the magnificent art that they claim was created at the time. Yet in the background, there seems to be some kind of death cult brewing, while the claim to fame of the Renaissance was about birth. So even though the Renaissance was sold and bought as a rebirth, we all bought it, it did not embrace the essence of women. Again, you know, there goes the divine feminine out the window. It just sought to end any reverence for the divine feminine altogether. And the church accepted no female clergy. So women were unable to receive as well. It was this big art thing, but women couldn't even study art. They weren't able to receive formal art training. Though some did, I can name a couple. Sofonsiba Anguissola was one of them, a late Renaissance painter of note. And then there was another, Lavina Teerlink, who was a Flemish Renaissance miniaturist. So all of the greatest artists of the time that we ever hear about, though, are men. You have to really dig deep to find the women. And then there was the case of Michelangelo. I mean, he did the Pieta, which is very beautiful, or so they say he did. But then when he did this sculpture, it was called Night and Day. It was as if he sculpted a male figure and then just blobbed these two breasts on top of the sculpture's chest. this sculpture of night and day is very confusing because you can see there's no love of women in it. It's just, oh, it's a sort of a male figure with these blobby breasts. And women were overlooked in the arts because painting was regarded as a distinctively male task during the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, for all its wailing about a rebirth, completely failed to deliver in the realms of empowering women in any way, shape, or form. I believe many of the nurturing paintings of Mary and Child and that were not produced, but rather inherited by the Renaissance leaders, because they don't represent the women. And there's this overbearing patriarchal stance of Medici et al. In power during the Renaissance. So it doesn't make any sense. This was the imagery of the patriarchy, and they were setting the stage. They were all poised to set the stage well into the future. And it was just a mere warming up for the wars planned that would come about 200 years later. Members of the Medici family were known tyrants and enemies of the Republic as well. Pope Leo X and Clement VII, they lost half the church to the Reformation. And there was a big series of clashes between Republicans in Italy and the Medici supporters, which culminated in a siege in I-529 in Florence. But then Clement installed Alessandro de' Medici as a duke, and then the Medici family ruled Florence and later even Tuscany from I-434 to I-737. But except for two very brief intervals, they mounted to 21 years in all that time of the 300 years that they reigned. But in that time, they installed 4 popes into the Roman Catholic Church, and the return of the Medici family to Florence became secured when the dukedom passed to Cosimo de' Medici, who was a descendant of a lesser branch of the family. So then Cosimo ruled Florence for over 30 years, and he's the one that established the Medici Dynasty that lasted for 2 centuries after that. And then the last Medici was just a joke, and he died without even having a male heir or anything, and that was in I-737. So this information kind of solidifies for us in no uncertain terms that this bloodline Medici family were both bankers and tyrants who did not have humanity's best interests at heart. And they hid behind this veil of philanthropy connected to the arts, much of which was most likely plundered, as I said earlier, from the great Tartarian Empire, especially and including the architecture. And they always look so good in this great architecture with the arches that are so high. They would never have built them that high because they're little. So these are really the critical moments in history that are never questioned. Since the time that our history was rewritten by Scaliger, I think the word scallywag comes from Scaliger. Anyway, these are pertinent observations of how religion and central banking systems have shaped our world, taken over the arts, note, and perpetuated the decline of human creativity ever since. This decline of human creativity is directly linked to the financial systems in play that relegate us to these daily menial tasks to uphold these prevailing dynastic families that have ruled our precious paradigm, using religion and taxes as weapons of weariness to quell the light within us. Anyway, it seems at some point that the control of religion and the control of international banking were split later on, the Vatican and the Medicis, because they became more territorially expansive and way too gargantuous to be the domain of just one family. So at the height of their power, the Medicis managed the majority of great fortunes in Europe, and that was for merchants and royalty. Seems to me the Medicis became the Rothschild role model in history, adopting their modus operandi for controlling these large swaths of the world through centralized banking. So it seems that great care was taken in keeping their personal wealth within their own bloodlines by allowing, they allow family members to marry cousins and all this stuff. Sometimes they were forced to introduce the blood of other high pedigree families here and there, to ensure that their inbreeding would not render them genetically inept, to keep a hold on the reins of power as they sought to dominate the world in perpetuity. And here we are today. So if we're going to be honest about this, the Renaissance sounds like just another time loop where the bad guys sit at the top holding all the purse strings as usual, while they watch humanity suffer at the cost of their greed, just like today. And so I'm sorry to pop any bubbles you've held dear about the Renaissance. Yes, indeed, the art was glorious, but did that vast inventory of classic stellar murals, sculptures, and paintings really come from a time when most of humanity was so suppressed? So to confirm this, all we need to do is look at the work of Peter Bruegel the Elder in 1525 is when he was born, I 525. And he was a Flemish Renaissance painter and printmaker, and he was known for his depictions of the life of common peasants and biblical allegories. And he was working in the 1500s in Antwerp, which constituted the Northern Renaissance faction. And one of his most famous paintings is the Tower of Babel. And he painted that 3 times. He was so obsessed with it. But each depiction shows the biblical Tower of Babel, which is that architectural tower reaching into heaven, which is said to represent the unification of mankind and their commitment to the church. The Tower of Babel, an architectural tower reaching into heaven and said to represent the unification of mankind and their commitment to the church and its religious doctrine. But upon closer inspection, it can be seen that the concept was taken from a passage in the Bible, Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, which is an unfinished tower, and it was painted when the church was dealing with that schism between the Catholic and Protestant theologies, of which the latter was taking a foothold in the Netherlands. And now we know today that the Netherlands is a stronghold of the cabal, along with Ukraine. So it's all starting to tie in here. So my interpretation of the painting is that Bruegel was depicting the folly of the Catholic Church and its worship of the fallen angels. And as today, the peasants were dirt poor, while the church was wealthy beyond measure and did nothing to help the poor. And the world today is a perpetuation of the same disparity that played out then. And many of Bruegel's other works show this disparity. In the payment of tithes, for instance, he shows the misery on the faces of the people bent over in submission, bringing their offerings and payments to the tithe collectors, who resemble these frowning tax accountants in their demeanor, with their papers and their pens. And then there's this strange returning motif in many of Bruegel's paintings, which are evidence of the towns in ruins. So could that be the evidence of the beginning of the methodical destruction of the architecture from the Tartarian realm? So this is how we determine that the Renaissance was nothing but a reset. It's very simple. Because remember, by I-400, history tells us that much of Europe had been Christian for 1,000 years. And these were the true Christians that lived in peace. April 27, 2014, Pope Francis held a ceremony in St. Peter's Square at the Vatican. I'm bringing you all the way back to today now to show the comparison. And declared to the entire world that Lucifer is the god of the Catholic Church. He said that. And when you go check it online, of course, it's all debunked, but that's what he said. The Pope as recently as 2014, confirmed the allegiance of the church to satanic forces. And it was these same forces that were in play during the Renaissance. So we may even go as far as to surmise that the rebirth meant the rebirth of Lucifer to replace the teachings of Christ. By their deeds shall ye know them. So the Renaissance featured all the pervasive elements of early transhumanism, globalism, and central banking, which has been mightily overlooked by historians in favor of focusing on the art that was said to have been produced at the time. And the Renaissance was therefore not a rebirth as claimed by historians. It was just another reset. Since the definition of insanity is to repeat the same mistakes and expect different results, perhaps the parallels I have shown here between the Renaissance period and today's fourth industrial revolution, Klaus Schwab's dream, will serve to raise us out of our malaise enough for us to jump off the treadmill trap of incarnation looping into the sea of Aquarius and float off into the golden age this time around. So get back in touch with your creativity that's been dutifully stolen from you over many, many years, especially women. Get back on track. Start drawing and painting. And as I've said in many of my other videos, if you learn how to do visual art, you can transfer that whole process into any area of life. So just remember that always, and teach somebody art, teach a kid art, do something artistic and creative, get you those neurons all fired up again. And I'll see you hopefully sooner than next month, but I'll shoot for January. And if I don't see you, have a wonderful new year. And as you can see, I've got a lot of work to do. I have commissions and I'm very busy with that. So I haven't got a lot of time to do any videos, and they do take a lot of time to edit because I like to put all the images in so that you can see exactly what's going on. So please like, share, comment. I love the comments. It makes me feel like I'm actually talking to somebody, getting through. And then, of course, if you like my work, you may wish to support it. So thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.